Good morning. It is November 10 at the COP23 climate conference in Bonn. It's halfway through the United Nations annual conference on climate change and how to address climate change. And this year the theme is how the Paris Agreement objectives defined 2 years ago are going to actually be reached in the real world. So today we have with us Chris Bliley of Growth Energy, the USA's largest ethanol producers association. We have Eric Sievers, Investment Director of Ethanol Europe, the operator of Europe's largest ethanol biorefinery. And we have Emmanuel Desplecken, who is the Secretary General of EPUR, Europe's Ethanol Producers Association. In the last few days we've been part of an enormous number of talks about how climate change is going to be addressed in the real world. The transport sector is the black sheep in terms of climate emissions still rising. The sector is still growing, and the solutions are not obviously the solutions aren't emerging very simply. The keynotes of all the discussions about transport decarbonizations have centered around electromobility and electrical vehicles. So what I'd like to do is ask the three guys here what their view on what the world should do about the transport sector, and whether electromobility is the only solution or what are the other options. So could I start with Emmanuel?
Sure. Thanks very much for the question, James. I think, first of all, you've said it, and it was also being stated this week by the European Environment Agency. The challenge for decarbonizing the economy lies right now in the transport sector. It's the one sector where the emissions keeps increasing, as you said, despite repeated efforts in policies to address that. But we've seen that the policies are actually broken when they seek to address the decarbonization. There's no holistic approach in it, and we have been focusing on the uptake of renewables, or we've been focusing on tailpipe emissions, but none of these policies actually coincide. And what we need to be looking at right now is a full life cycle analysis of the vehicles and of the fuels that are being put on the market. From that perspective, I don't want to be misunderstood. We do believe that electromobility has a role to play, but it's not the panacea. Like biofuels was not the panacea 10 years ago when we started to discuss its uptake. I think we now need to have a clear path on a full life cycle analysis where we can have the best low carbon fuels deliver on the greenhouse gas reduction. That includes electromobility, but that also includes ethanol. And the best combination today, it's not to have either electromobility or ethanol, it's to have both combined. The perfect car already exists today. It's an E20 hybrid cars, but this is not being promoted because we are working in silos. We are either looking at tailpipe emissions or we are looking at fuels separately.
Okay.
We need to combine those.
Yeah, very good. And Eric, you've been here for the last few days. Do you think that holistic picture is being reflected in the discussions happening at COP23 this year?
As far as a holistic picture, I think something's lacking. What's here is an ambition and a desire to see great transformation. But if we look back in the past decade, the only low-carbon transport that actually exists is ethanol fuel vehicles, the only thing that exists on a large scale. So if 15 years ago the entire transport sector was fueled by fossil fuels, today a good chunk of that, around 5%, is renewable energy. And that is almost all ethanol. There's other forms of biofuels also, but ethanol is the dominant biofuel, and it has a tremendously positive impact on the climate. And in addition to that, it's the one type of renewables, large-scale renewables, which really feeds directly into the Sustainable Development Goals. So ethanol plants, as they actually exist in large scale, in America especially and in Europe, are tremendous motors of rural renaissance and rural sustainable development, which is exactly the kind of thing that we need in addition to transport decarbonization.
Chris, there are 47 delegates from the US government over here for the 2 weeks and negotiating across all the sectors on how the Paris Agreement targets should be implemented. What do you reckon those delegates are saying in terms of the transport sector and how to address the growing emissions in the transport sector?
Yeah, thanks, James. I think one of the things we certainly hope that they would address is how we can reflect that we've done in the United States with biofuels and with ethanol in particular, how we've been able to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, and how other countries can take advantage of ethanol's renewable properties and meet their own climate goals. In the U.S., we're using 15 billion gallons, roughly 10% of all of our gasoline is ethanol blended. We think ultimately use of close to 36 billion gallons of renewable fuel will be the equivalent of taking 27 million cars off the road. As these guys just talked about, and transportation remains sort of the big hurdle that we have to get to in addressing these climate goals. And we think ethanol is one of the great solutions. The infrastructure is already developed around liquid fuels. Ethanol is high octane. It allows automakers to optimize their engines as they meet higher fuel efficiency standards.
So you've got 10% effectively now in the US.
That's correct.
And what's the next step? Are you going for 15%, 20%?
So right now we have approval to go to 15%, and we're building that market in the United States. But I think ultimately, not only in the US, but globally, we're looking at a high octane fuel, a mid-level blend, an E25 or an E30 blend that's close to 100 RON. That really gives automakers the flexibility to downsize their engines, turbocharge them, make them higher compression, and that would not only being able to use renewable fuel, but that would also significantly improve the vehicle's efficiency as well.
Right. Okay. COP23 is focused to a large extent on 2030 as a milestone, and then 2050 as a milestone. All of the figures show that the world fleet of vehicles is still growing at anything between 2 and 3% a year. It may not sound a lot, but that actually would lead to a doubling of the fleet between now and 2050. And most of that growth is still in fossil-burning engines. To what extent can ethanol and the equivalent in the diesel sector amortize or reduce the effect of those growing emissions until we get to a period where electromobility is kicking in at a scale that's significant? Because right now electromobility, as much as it's visible in Northern Europe, is actually not relevant anywhere else. Do you see, Emmanuel, what are the measures that are going to help us manage this growth in the time it takes for electro infrastructure to...
I think you're right to first realize that indeed in the short, medium, but even long term, most of the cars will actually be still running on liquid fuels. Today we have about 4% in Europe of cars running on alternative technologies. It's not a lot. In the most optimistic scenarios of the European Union, the electromobility will not go beyond 15 to 20% by 2030. So that means we still have to work on decarbonizing the current fleet, not only the new cars that will come along, but also the second-hand cars that are still
on the road.
Yeah, still on the road. From that perspective, ethanol definitely has a role to play in the transition to electromobility. We help with our ethanol to actually have cleaner fuel, so both in terms of CO2 reduction, but also air pollutants. That's desperately needed because we've had too much of a focus on CO2 reduction at the expense of air pollutants, and ethanol actually reconciles the two. So we actually deliver in those aspects as well.
Well, to Eric, if I can ask, let's say we're talking to climate legislators here today. Regarding ethanol, is there anything they should be worried about? Are there caveats? Are there limits to what we can do with it?
Yeah, certainly there are limits. I think one of the big misconceptions about ethanol and ethanol advocates is ethanol's not trying to become the next oil. It's not trying to capture 100% of oil's market share. We need a real transformation of the transportation sector. But as Emmanuel said, it's not like liquid fuels will go away tomorrow. We need to phase out oil simply because that's the only that's the only realistic scenario. And using ethanol to phase out the fossil fuel is an ideal scenario because on its current trend of improvements on life cycle analysis, greenhouse gas savings, ethanol in Europe already has 70% greenhouse gas savings, up from under 50% just a few years ago. And we know it's going over to 90%. And when the life cycle benefits of a cleaner burning fuel on gasoline are factored in, ethanol is over 100%. So using ethanol in increasing amounts as the amount of gasoline in the fuel supply goes down is a way to introduce electrification while at the same time capturing the maximum amount of decarbonization benefits from the remaining liquid fuel supply.
Very good. All right. In next year, we've got COP24. It's going to take place in Katowice in Poland. From your experience this week here in Bonn, would you be thinking of coming back? What would you say to the rest of the sector about the value and importance of turning up here?
Yeah, I think it's certainly been valuable. As I said, I think a lot of what we do in the United States, and I would say globally, is education. A lot of what we've all talked about, the benefits you see with ethanol, not only on greenhouse gas emissions, but what Emmanuel talked about on air toxics, PM, particulate emission reductions. These are all things that benefit different countries and their economies. There's also the rural development piece. I mean, we've seen a significant rural development renaissance in the United States with the growth of ethanol and renewable fuels. So there are benefits, in many different levels to many of these countries, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of education because a lot of countries may not recognize all those values. And it's affordable, it's available, and it's something that we can help, show to the world.
Yeah, great. Okay. Yeah. All right. Concluding comments from Emmanuel. Anything else you'd like a key takeaway for people attending COP23?
Well, I think coming back on your question about what legislators could do, actually, there is a tendency, and I think that's our frustration, is that there is a tendency from the legislator to always go for the next big thing at the expense of what exists today. And I can actually see that today in the COP as well, in the exhibition, where there seems to be some sort of competition between clean technologies. And that actually goes at the expense of what we all want to do, which is to reduce the consumption of fossil fuel. So in policy, we see the same perversity, which is always to play renewables or low carbon fuels against each other, instead of actually capitalizing. So the role of second generation biofuels is not to displace first generation biofuels. The role of electromobility is not to displace biofuels. We should be adding these low carbon resources together to reduce fossil fuel and in fine to benefit the planet.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much. Eric?
Sure, we're in 2017. This is not 2007. So our discussions about ethanol should be based upon what the actual state of the world is. And in the actual state of the world, the feedstocks from which ethanol is produced, whether that's sugar cane or sugar beet or wheat or corn or sorghum, the prices of these feedstocks now are less than they were 10 years ago. There is no food versus fuel concern that is at all relevant at the scale of the biofuels industry today. And in fact, our biofuel plant and all the biofuel plants in America, we produce just as much animal feed and food per ton as we do ethanol. And then second, the most common misperception about ethanol is that it might be expensive. But even though we would, as a commercial enterprise, wish for the price to be higher, whether you're in Brazil or America or Europe, you're selling your ethanol into the market today at less than 50 cents a liter, less than $2 a gallon. So it's just not an expensive alternative energy source.
Yeah, we in Europe, Chris, have had enormous discussions about the implications for agriculture and land use when ethanol or any biofuels are being used. What we've found to be the overriding experience here is that all of the ethanol produced here has been produced from yield increase and better land management, and none of it has required any new land whatsoever. And even under the most optimistic projections of ethanol use in Europe, that would still be the same over the next 10, 15, 20 years. In the USA, has this been similar? Has it required new land, or is it all a yield question?
No, I think you're exactly right, James. It has been improvements in efficiency, not only on the feedstock side, but on the production side as well of ethanol. Our farmers, we would argue, are among the best in the world, if they are the best in the world, and they improve all the time. They're getting better yields out of their crops, better seeds, better equipment. It's much more precise, and they're able to frankly do more with existing or even less land. Today we're producing close to 16 billion gallons of ethanol in the U.S., and we continue to see that grow as more demand grows globally. And we're going to have to continue those improvements going forward.
Yeah, well, the European car makers are very important in the whole transition to clean energy and a low carbon transport sector. Are European cars able to handle ethanol, Emmanuel?
They are. The question is whether their cars will actually be optimized to it. And I think that the difficulty for them is actually, we've had some stop and go, not system, but in legislation, and that has actually hindered the ability of the car makers to optimize their cars. So today they homologate their cars when it's a gasoline car on E10. But we already know that their cars are already compatible with E20. It's just not optimized because we don't have a standard. So we need to have policy and car makers and stakeholders moving at the same time and no more stop-and-go policies.
So it's not a big technical problem, it's just simply an organizational problem with the standards authorities in Europe?
Absolutely, because car makers in Europe also sell their cars in the US and they also sell their cars in Brazil, where every liter of gasoline has actually 27% of ethanol, so they can do it. Yeah? It's not a problem.
Right, okay. One more thing regarding, you're an actual producer in Europe.
Correct.
You're buying a lot of grain from farmers in Europe. Farmers in Europe are being affected by trade talks, by Brexit, by all kinds of things. They seem to be getting the sore end of everything that's going on right now. Regarding the legislation around biofuels for transport, what should the farm sector be thinking?
The farm sector hasn't had, in Europe, the farm sector hasn't had the same set of incentives as in America. And as a result, European farmers have not increased their yields as much as in the United States. And that's not because of any difference in soils or weather. And contrary to popular belief, it actually has nothing to do with the availability of GM crops in one market or the other. It's that farmers are hard-pressed to make investments. Investments are their own money, it's their own risk. And what we see from the ethanol sector in the United States and in some pockets of Europe is that biofuel plants are a stimulator of, an enabler of agricultural investment to produce more food for all sectors. And of course, in America as well as in Europe, you have crop rotation. And so one year you may be growing a crop that's destined for biofuels, but any improvements that you get on that biofuel crop spill over into the wheat or the soybean or other crops. So what we really see in Europe is the need for a biofuels policy that recognizes the ability of biofuels to stimulate agricultural investment that sweeps across the whole sector and makes the entire sector more resilient.
You started buying grain in Hungary 5-6 years ago when you opened your plant there, and that's doubled in size in the meantime. That would be quite a significant change for the region in which you're located. What have been the impacts in that short time, both in the region and then have you seen impacts Europe-wide?
That's a great question, James. So when we began our investment, the Hungarian maize yields were stagnant for 30 years, which is already a stunning statistic. Because in Western Europe and in the United States, that yield had gone up dramatically. And what we saw last year in Hungary was on even less land, about 40% more grain. And of course, harvests are spotty, you can have bad weather and but what we see is that because of the existence of an ethanol industry, a local stable buyer of crops, we've seen a dramatic increase in yields, which we expect to continue.
So the grain that you buy from the farmers in Hungary is not coming from markets that they were serving before. It's all additional produce that they're coming.
Well,
it's all
again,
additional produce and additional income.
Exactly, James. And remember that for every ton of ethanol that we produce a ton of high-protein animal feed. So combining that with the extra grain that is produced, then yeah, we're not displacing any grain from other uses.
The high-protein animal feed, I'm Irish, Ireland markets itself as a source of highly sustainable, healthy organic food. How is that relevant for somewhere like Ireland?
It's very relevant. Biofuel plants in Europe are offsetting about 1/3 of the imports of vegetable protein from the Americas. Europe is extremely dependent. It's almost as protein import dependent as it is energy import dependent. And so biofuel plants actually help on both fronts to make Europe more self-sufficient.
By producing protein animal feed.
By producing energy and protein.
Yeah. Very good. I was very curious about using that protein animal feed within the livestock sector. And I was reading recently that usage of the protein animal feed in the dairy sector specifically has been rising considerably in the last 10, 15 years. Are you aware of where it is now in the USA and how the relationship between ethanol and dairy, for instance?
Sure. I think you're right. Originally there was some skepticism and some questions from our livestock industry about the use of DDGs, of distillers grains, of protein. But today, it's very much related. In fact, a lot of our livestock producers they've become dependent on it, and they actually like it because it gives them a little bit better flexibility on what they can provide to their in rations to their animals. We're seeing it not only in dairy, but in beef and pork and even poultry as well. I think poultry has been among those who've sort of been more resistant to the use of protein from ethanol, but we've actually seen them using it more and more these days. So we're seeing it broadly, and we're getting more support, I think, amongst our livestock sector. They're seeing that it can be, that we can coexist and not impact the prices. I think Eric started off the conversation earlier. This isn't 2007. Today, our farmers are getting significantly less than they were, several years ago, and mainly due to a drought in the U.S. And we're producing record crops of corn. It's really become a huge demand sector for our ag producers. And at the same time, not only are we producing the fuel, we're producing the feed as well. And today, a modern biofuel plant is also extracting corn oil for biodiesel. We're capturing CO2 for other purposes. We've really, integrated and expanded the processes.
Very good. Thank you. Listen, our time is up. That was a great discussion. I've been convinced for a long time that ethanol is a kind of a peace of mind solution for transport decarbonisation. I really hope that the COP23 conference somehow gets some of that and sees the positives in it. And I hope to be back here next year spreading the word. Thank you very much, Chris, Eric, Emmanuel.
Thank you.
Okay.